This video is about interpreting graphs of functions and specifically looking at where a function is positive or negative. So the first thing to look at is the couple of different ways in which this question can be asked. So the question might just say, find the range of values of x for which f of x is positive, or alternatively for which f of x is negative. And just to point out that the word range, don't let it put you off. If they mention range, that's just an indication that they want you to use an inequality symbol, so a less than or a greater than symbol. They might also just say find the values of x for which f of x is positive and f of x is negative. But for these questions, you'll always have to use inequalities anyway. So instead of saying f of x is positive or f of x is negative, you could also find that they'll say f of x is greater than 0. Or in the case of negative, they might say that f of x is less than 0. But you might also see a slightly different version of this where they say f of x is greater than or equals to 0, or f of x is less than or equals to 0. And really the only difference between these two is that in the case of the greater than or less than, you'll just use a greater than or less than in your answer. And in the case of greater than or equal to or less than or equal to, you'll have a greater than or equal to or a less than or equal to in your answer. So you kind of watch the question for a hint as to the symbol that you want to use in your solution. So if there's an equals bit in the question, you'll have an equals bit in your answer. And if there's no equals bit in the question, well, you'll leave out the equals bit in your answer as well. So in order to be able to answer any of these, I need to know what they actually mean. So when we say that the function is positive, we just mean the function is above the x-axis. And then on the other hand, if they said that the function is negative, then they're talking about where is it below the x-axis. As with previous videos on interpreting functions, I'm going to use these 5 functions to help me answer some questions. So if you have them previously graphed, well then go back and use them to refer to as we go through the solutions. And if you don't, it might be a good plan to graph them first. So let's start off with our f of x function. And we've got 2 questions here. For what range of values of x is f of x greater than 0? And then secondly, for what range of values of x is f of x less than or equals to 0? Well, don't forget, f of x is greater than 0 means what? It means that I'm looking at where the function is above the x-axis. So let's go to our diagram and deal with this first. So I'm going to look at my quadratic and I'm going to highlight the area of the graph that is above the x-axis. So I've highlighted 2 parts of my graph, this bit here on the left and this bit here on the right. Okay, so when I want to give my answer, I want to have a look at where those 2 highlighted regions meet the x-axis. So you can see here that I'm meeting the x-axis at 0 and I'm meeting the x-axis at 4. Now, this green region comes before I get as far as 0 on the x-axis, and this green region comes after I hit 4 on the x-axis. If it's before a value, it's less than. If it's after a value, it's greater than. So in this case, I should write my answer as x is less than 0 and x is greater than 4. Notice that the question was a symbol without an equals part, so I didn't use an equals bit in my symbol either. Okay, so next I'm looking for the range of values of x for which f of x is less than or equals to 0. So again, I need to have a think about what this actually means. So this means I'm looking at the region below the x-axis. So again, I'm going to go back to my diagram. I'm going to highlight that part of my curve. So I've highlighted that part of my curve in orange here, and I can see that it starts at 0 and it goes over as far as 4. And again, I'm looking at those points where I start and finish on the x-axis. So this time, this orange section is to the right of the 0 and it's to the left of the 4. And again, that'll help me decide on my symbols. So I'll say that x is greater than or equal to 0 and less than or equal to 4. And notice I'm including an equals part because it was an equals part in the question. Also notice that it's just one region of my curve that I've highlighted. So I can actually run these together in one statement if I like. I can write my answer as 0 less than or equal to x less than or equal to 4. And when I write something in this way, it just means the x values between 0 and 4 are where I am below the x-axis. Okay, so let's do it again now. So for g of x. So I want to find the range of values of x for which g of x is greater than 0. So again, what does this mean? Well, when I see g of x is greater than 0, I know that it means I'm looking above the x-axis. So I'm going to highlight that part of my diagram. Okay, so how should I write my solution then for this? Well, I'm above the x-axis before -2 in this case, and after 1. So that's how I write my answer. Notice that I don't run it together into one statement because I've got two separate regions of my graph highlighted. Next, I want to find the range of values of x for which g of x is less than or equal to 0. Again, this means under the x-axis. I'll highlight that part of my graph. So I've highlighted that part of my graph in orange, and you can see that it's to the right of -2 and to the left of 1. So I'll point my symbols accordingly. I've included an equals part because of the question. And again, because it's just one region, I can run it together into one statement if I like, just like this. Okay, so here we have h of x. Okay, so now I've changed the question slightly. So I want to know for what range of values of x is h of x less than 0? And then for what range of values of x is h of x greater than 0? Okay, so let's start with h of x being less than 0. Well, what does this mean again? This means I'm looking below the x-axis, so less than 0, below the x-axis. So I'm going to highlight that part of my graph. And again, I look at where it starts and finishes on the x-axis. So in this case, I'm looking at -1 and 1.5. And I'm going to the right of -1 and to the left of 1.5. And I can leave my answer like this, or I can run it together in one statement because it's just one region that I've shaded. And I could write it like this, -1 less than x less than 1.5. Next, I want to know for what range of values of x is h of x greater than 0. So again, what does this actually mean? Well, h of x is greater than 0 means that I'm looking above the x-axis. So I've highlighted the regions above the x-axis, and they are to the left of -1 and to the right of 1.5. So I'll say x is less than -1 and x is greater than 1.5. Now notice this time I didn't use an equals part on my solution because it wasn't an equals part on the question. Okay, so here we have our j of x function, and I've just changed the wording of the question again slightly. So first one says, for what range of values of x is j of x positive? So what do I mean by j of x being positive? Well, positive means that I'm looking above the x-axis. So I'll highlight that part of the diagram. Okay, so those regions have been highlighted in green now. And looking carefully at my diagram, that looks like it's before -2.5 and after about 0.8. Again, read these as accurately as you can from your own diagram. Everyone's graph will be a tiny bit different. As long as you answer it as accurately as possible for your own values, you'll be fine. Okay, so then for what range of values of x is j of x negative? Well, what does that mean if it's negative? So negative means that I'm looking below the x-axis. And I'll be using the same number values again, -2.5 and 0.8. This time I'm going to say x is greater than -2.5. And x is less than 0.8. And again, because it's one region, I can run these together in the answer if I like. Finally, we have our k of x function, and I want to know for what range of values of x is k of x positive, and for what range of values of x is k of x negative. So first of all, the positive, this means above the x-axis. So I've highlighted that part of the graph, and it's from -1 on and up as far as +1. So I'll say x is greater than -1 and x is less than 1. If I want, I can write this as -1 less than x less than 1. And finally, I want to find the range of values for which x is, of x for which k of x is negative. That means below the x-axis. So I've highlighted those here. And that's going to be before -1 and after 1. And so I'll write my answer as x is less than -1 and x is greater than 1. Notice in the last two questions for both j of x and k of x, I just used less than and greater than symbols. I didn't use any equals part in my symbol. And that's the way to approach it if they talk about the function being positive or negative. They just use the words positive or negative. No need to use equals parts on your symbols.